Hello friends, in today's video I'm going to share 5 tips on how to paint a watercolor peony. Mainly I wanted to talk about my own process of creating this watercolor painting because it gave me quite a hard time and I've been working on it on and off for about a month. A much longer real-time tutorial can be found on my Patreon in case you want to paint right alongside of me. And now let's get to the tips. Peony is quite a challenging flower, not only to paint but to draw as well, at least for me. Its complexity comes from having way too many petals that run in all directions. And also petals in the middle section have different and less regular shapes than those close to the edge of the flower. With that being said, my first tip is to draw the peony several times before you attempt a larger painting. I found the drawing practice very useful and it is what made peony less intimidating for me. What helps me personally is not to focus on every individual petal that the peony contains. Sometimes when you look at a random reference photo, shape of some petals might look confusing from that particular angle, and so it rarely makes sense to copy every petal religiously from a photo. Rather, try imagining petals existing in groups and petals from the same group having similar shape and direction to them, which makes them quite easy to draw. I know this might not sound like a groundbreaking tip for you, like practice and you'll get better at it. But what I mean by the drawing tip is that with peony you really need to find a way to become familiar with how this structure works in order to paint shadows, because it's like a labyrinth. When painting easier flowers such as magnolias, tulips and so on, it is quite easy to imagine where to place shadows just by looking at the photo. But with peony I was failing hard at shading the center without spending some time doing a few studies. Trust me, give it at least an hour or two in your sketchbook and you'll be ready to paint. By the way, I posted a bonus video with drawing a peony exercises on my Patreon as well. I will link it for you to the description of this video. Second tip is to use a simple color palette and focus on tone rather than color shifts. I used 4 colors for this peony: yellow, green, Indian yellow, wisteria and alizarin crimson. I do regret using wisteria. This paint is quite opaque. I should have used magenta instead, and I did not really need the green gold for this one either. Rather, I would go for cerulean blue next time if I was to paint it again. When trying to mix too many colors, it is very easy to forget about tonal values and lose contrast. It can also distract you too much if you're still getting used to watercolor. Limiting your palette will help you focus more on how the medium actually works and how to keep the watery paint in the right places. Third tip is to build the painting slowly from light to dark. You will definitely need patience and a bit more time than usual when painting watercolor peony, and I was really losing mine after a while on this flower. What I noticed is that sometimes I get a strong urge to quickly jump forward in my painting process and add too much pigment into the washes early on. This often disrupts the lightness of the painting, as I tend to cover more of the paper than I would if I was building towards the darker area systematically in layers and throughout the entire painting. So that's something that I am currently working on, trying to control myself and simply exercise the patience in adding color. With mediums like gouache, you can easily bring back the highlights or create more softer lights with the white paint, but watercolor works differently, and once you cover something up with paint, there is a limit to what you can remove. Usually you can lift some of the pigment from the paper, but the paper will never be white again, and more often than not, the area you are trying to lighten will only go back a tiny bit, and that at the risk of damaging your paper. So measure twice and cut once definitely applies here. And if this already happened and you stumbled upon a realization that your painting is already way too dark mid-process, don't be afraid to start again. Just transfer your sketch to a new watercolor paper and don't think twice about it. This happens all the time, and I never feel I lost the time spent on a spoiled painting, because it's thanks to that time that I'm able to paint it well on a second try. My next tip is to vary your brushes when painting complex subjects such as peony. Switching your brushes throughout the process can be annoying. It helps the workflow to finish the painting with just one brush, and there are definitely subjects that allow for that. But here is where I found brushes of at least two sizes very useful. It is either hard to get into some corners and tight spots, or you need to fill a larger area very quickly. A tight spot brush should be smaller, have a sharp tip, and it shouldn't hold a ton of water. This excess water can interfere with trying to keep only a small area wet. I painted this peony on a A3 sized paper, and there were still some areas so tiny that when trying to keep a certain color there, an accidental drop of water from a brush that holds too much would cause a mess. Does this also happen to you? Let me know. On the other hand, parts of this peony were absolutely not suited for the tiny brush, mostly these marginal petals that are quite sizable, and you need to fill them with paint fast. You want to fill these with watercolor and keep each petal wet for a bit to be able to play with the color inside and create gradients or adjust the intensity of the color. Once it dries, it's settled. Trying to fill this area with a small brush leads to patchy results because brushstrokes tend to dry fast, and therefore it's hard to achieve the wet state of the entire petal. And this was also my problem. I was using Escoda brushes in size 8 and 4, yet I kept forgetting to switch to the larger one as I got lost in the process in this stage. Now rewatching my process as I edit this video, I feel the need to paint this again and do much cleaner washes for the larger parts of this flower. My last tip regards the background. It is not always needed to add background to your flower studies, but it can be a great addition, and especially with these light flowers, I wouldn't be afraid to experiment with it. I used a mix of my favorite dark paints for the background, such as indigo, Payne's gray, and mixed in some green gold, which appears as a dark green in this mix. Be careful around the edges of the flower, but make sure that everything is dry before attempting to lay down this wash. You don't want the darks to accidentally bleed into the flower. I also tend to add literally pools of water to my paper when creating a background like this. You can let the pools dry naturally and see what kind of blooms they can create. If you aren't satisfied with overall darkness of the background or how the pools look when they dry, you can absolutely add another layer. I was being more intentional with this one as I didn't want to cover up the nice blooms altogether, just deepen the area around the flower. Here is where I added more pigment and then feathered that outwards to preserve most of the underneath layer. One great thing about the dark background is that once you apply it, you suddenly are able to see more clearly how much contrast you build on your actual subject, and the change from how this appears on a white background is huge. Suddenly the entire mid section of the flower appears so light in comparison that adjusting the shadows is what needs to be done. And also, to balance out the colors, I had to add a light wash of the background colors to the shadows on almost every flower petal. This took some time, but it finally made the flower pop. At this stage, my patience was really exercised and I wished for the process to be finally over, but one last step of adding some details to the petals was needed. This layer luckily didn't take as much time, and it involved me drawing a few lines with a tiny brush, indicating veins of the petals and a bit of texture. I always enjoy experimenting with watercolor, and so I used a few splatters and drops of paint to try and decorate the flower in the end. If this turned out well, I am not entirely sure. You can be a judge of that and let me know in the comments if you preferred it without the expressive strokes or with them, but I'm certain that I need to practice painting peony much more this year. Flowers are my second favorite subject to paint right after portraits, and I have a whole series of paintings planned featuring floral patterns alongside the female portraits, and I need to make my flowers look more exciting and light than this, and so I'm really looking forward to the practice. As I mentioned earlier, you can paint this flower with me in real time on my Patreon. There is also a bonus video of how I draw peonies, and your support means a lot to me. And with that, I'll see you in the next video. Have a great week and bye bye!